Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. It's a pleasure to have you here, probably long overdue to have BDIC come and present to this committee, so we're pretty excited about having you here. We have another individual that will be joining us here in a moment, and another member that is in Hay River and actually is just not joining in with us here, but is watching live, and so he felt it was important to tune in. To get started, maybe then what I will do is I'll just ask the members here to introduce themselves. I'll start to my immediate right.
Good morning, Danny McNeely for the Sahtu region.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
And Cory Vanthuyne, MLA for Yellowknife North. We also have with us today from our research department, Gustavo Oliveira, and from the clerk's office, Michael Ball. And without further ado, what I'll do is, Mr. Jensen, is it yourself that's going to be the lead to start for opening comments? I'll turn it over to you. Just before we get started, a couple reminders, because there are some people in here that have not come and presented here for a while. And so you don't have to press any buttons for your microphone. Our technician, Indio, will do that, but he does that through an exchange with me. So just acknowledge the chair as you begin and end your comments. The other thing that I like to remind people of is to please refrain from doing any kind of tapping or clicking of pens or what have you. The mics pick it up very easily, and so we'll try to refrain from doing that. But without further ado, Mr. Jensen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is our pleasure today to offer this technical briefing on the Business Development and Investment Corporation, or BDIC. Joining me today are Pawan Chu, Chief Executive Officer for the BDIC. To my further right is Leonard Kwong, Director, Finance and Programs, and to my left, Julie Moitchin, Director of Finance for the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Our governments invest daily in the future of small businesses with targeted policies, programs, and funding initiatives. Northwest Territories Business Development and Investment Corporation is an important part of this work. With the permission of committee, we have worked together to prepare a presentation which Mr. Chu will now deliver, that will set the stage for our discussion, after which we're willing to answer any questions that members may have. That concludes my opening remarks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Do you go by Chu or Chung?
Chug.
Chug, right. We know each other by first names mostly, so. Mr. Chug, I turn it over to you for to make the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation. In interest of time, if you allow me, I'll make a very summarized presentation first, and if there's more time left, I can go through specific slides if time is left, so that we have some time for questions and answers.
Yep, typically that's the way we like to do it. We want to be efficient on the presentations, and then we like to turn it over to committee for some question and answer period, and if you have to go back to certain slides at that time, then we can certainly do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for giving this opportunity to make the presentation. I'll start with the key and most important question, which is, what's the purpose of BDIC? Let me start with an example which was brought to my attention recently by the head of a similar organization in Australia. In Australia, an organization similar to us this is just one of their projects, runs a project where they turn shipping containers into houses. What they do is they find youth and people who are looking for training, apprenticeship. For first few weeks, they are not paid, but they are trained as apprentices. Once they are trained, They are given the job within the organization, and then they make trailers into houses. And those houses are then sold, and it becomes a profitable venture. So it addresses a lot of issues like social issues of creating employment, providing employment, coaching the youth, and also addressing the housing shortage. And at the end of the day, making some money out of the project. The whole PowerPoint presentation which has been submitted to you is around this question 0. What exactly are we trying to accomplish? Slide 4 and 5 speak to it. The BDIC was to serve a single window to assist businesses in all NWT communities, taking into account the socio-economic impacts of its operations. Time after time, Hansard showed that formation of BDIC was with a mandate to provide one-stop access to not only business financing, but also through business support services and business development assistance across all NWT communities. The concept of one-stop shop was client-focused. However, over time, the mandate of one-stop shop went missing to almost being vanished, subsequently resulting in the reduction of the capacity and resources of BDIC. Slide 5 of pre-BDIC report talks about Common Grounds 2000, recommending streamlining access to lending programs and services for small businesses in NWT. Andrew Gamble and Associates report in 2002 recommended the creation of a single regional agency delivering all GNWT business programs. The goal should be a single regional agency delivering all GNWT programs. Report of the NWT Bankers Commission in 2002 recommended the creation of a single funding agency to assist businesses that may not be able to obtain bank financing. The most common form of human nature is forgetting what we were trying to accomplish. This was stated in a publication on entrepreneurship in social sector. Unfortunately, results happen outside of the organization and are controlled by people outside of the organization. Whether the slide is on formation of BDIC, which is slide 5, or on upcoming program review, slide 39, or BDIC program delivery mechanisms and achievements, slides 12 to 39. The intent is to answer the key question, why BDIC? To answer, we need to look at 3 elements. 1, BDIC's vision. 2, capacity to achieve the vision. And 3, resources to deliver the vision. Our vision, slides number 2 to 9 speak to it. An accountable and independent Crown Corporation providing resources for the economic development of Northwest Territories. The focus here is on 2 keywords, economic development. That is NWT's economic development by encouraging the creation and development of businesses in communities. The vision is to support the economy. It is aligned with the purpose of BDIC's existence. According to the Act, as on slide 8, the purpose of the corporation is to support economic objectives of the Government of Northwest Territories in a manner that benefits the people and the economy of Northwest Territories. BDIC's existing programs and services, the output measure, and the successes of the programs are listed and exhibited in slides 11 to 34. Slide 9, titled The BDIC Focus, depicts BDIC's achievements with supporting 1,000 ongoing jobs and approval of over $87 million in funding to over 500 small to medium-sized businesses. The accumulated surplus in the loan and bond fund has changed from negative of about $5 million to a positive of close to $20 million. The BDIC was targeting to get the loan fund money due to GNWT fully paid off by 2028. These are very encouraging numbers and have been looked better if BDIC had not been actively involved in social side of development. Interest rebates, like slide 20, is just one example where decisions involved social relief over financial gains and results. Economic development cannot be sustained by overlooking the social problems or, for that matter, social development. And BDIC has a much broader role than granting financial rebates. Financial rebates and BDPF grants are only some of the financial implements helping existing and new businesses. Social financing is another significant way with which to achieve economic development with better and measurable social outcomes. BDIC board on several occasions had engaged in strategic planning and concluded that social aspects cannot be ignored for sustainable economic development. The subsidiary programs, slides 28 and 29, depict strong social elements of community development and employment creation. The outcome of these programs are measured by their contribution to employment creation and increased community development and prosperity, and not in terms of financial gains. Do we have the capacity? Capacity and support cannot be defined if we are not clear on the vision and purpose of our existence. Our capacity is becoming limited to operate as a developmental institution. The contribution reduction of close to $2 million since 2016-17 fiscal year has and will have an impact on BDIC ability to contribute to a sustainable economy and to participate fully in the economic and social betterment of the NWT. It is one thing to achieve economic prosperity, but another to sustain it. The importance is on how to sustain it. 2 program reviews have been completed in the past, and as stated in the last slide, number 39, there is another upcoming. The terms of reference are in the process of being released. Unfortunately, the program reviews are focused and limited to BDIC and not client-focused. To be relevant, the reviews should be focused on optimization of resources and how BDIC can achieve the value for which it was created. Recommendations should have come from the reviews focused on clients. These reviews should have identified that BDIC is handcuffed on delivering on economic prosperity with a major hurdle of not being allowed to collaborate with Aboriginal economic development organizations, with hamlets and societies, and other similar organizations. When resources are limited, collaborations could be a solution. Unfortunately, the program reviews have been geared toward downsizing BDIC rather than optimizing resources and capacity for BDIC to achieve the vision of its creation. Resources. The slide number 36, BDIC budget over time, on BDIC funding depicts the gradual reduction in funding of BDIC. Since its inception in 2005 and to date, the funding was reduced from $3.8 million per year to $1.8 million per year, a significant reduction of over 52%. This is considerable. We understand and appreciate that the GNWT is trying hard to maximize resources. It is important to understand that BDIC is supportive and dedicated in assisting GNWT with this goal, and as an outcome, not only looks at optimizing available resources within BDIC, but looks at optimizing them system-wide by reaching out to organizations locally and nationally to share resources. Evidences like mentor-mentee program, youth boot camps, financial literacy, delivered in partnership with other institutions, are proven benefits and successes for NWT residents without doubt. Despite the limitation of resources, our attempts to take these initiatives to community level are still ongoing. To deliver on our responsibility of overall leadership on economic development of NWT, we are trying to engage other organizations on prosperity of businesses, youth, women, Aboriginal people, and community development. We are trying to shift policy outcomes by sharing our financial and non-financial resources with other organizations like Community Futures on development of communities, slide 18, with funding providers like Canor on business services, slide 32-33, and holding conferences like NEDP with Chamber of Commerce in promoting their events and celebrating successful businesses, with our competitors like BDC and MDDF on business development, and with community developers like Algiant by sponsoring events on community developments. These initiatives are to promote more options to NWT residents where our funds are not enough to take on the challenges solely on our own. To us, this is the real meaning of optimizing resources. We are sharing the resources to deliver the best or give more choices to the NWT residents. The new reality is to deliver with collaboration and not by competing, allowing or mandating the BDIC to collaborate with community development organizations with socio-economic goals like Aboriginal Economic Development Organizations, hamlets, and social development societies and institutions would be one of the ways to build and sustain the road to economic prosperity of NWT. Slide 37 on use of interest revenue has the option of allowing the use of interest revenues for the operations. BDIC understands that, and it's our understanding that this is that the amendments to the Act are already in process. BDIC believes that there were other options also, if considered, would have served the purpose. The BDIC cannot use its interest income to pay off the loan debt to GNWT at present. An amendment to allow BDIC to do that would have similar impact on release of cash for GNWT to use for other priorities and would have been win-win for all stakeholders. By allowing this, BDIC would have moved faster on its road to self-sufficiency and loan and bond fund, which is our major portfolio. Our target was to achieve this in next 7 to 10 years, but now with reduction of funding and use of funds to meet our operation expenses, these targets are not achievable. Similar to the beginning, I will conclude by sharing 2 more examples of global economic development organizations which have successfully addressed social issues with projects on economic development. To quickly share with you, me and my board chair, we went to a Penward function, and they had taken us to show these successful projects in USA. They had an apprenticeship shop where they were recruiting youth to repair cars. So they had this whole workshop there, and these recruits were being paid a proper salary to repair the cars, but at the same time, the public was allowed to bring their cars in for repairs. So it was a win-win for everyone. There was employment creation, there was income generation, and at the end of the day, the public was being served and profits were being made. In Bangladesh, Danone yogurt is another example where the issue is another social issue, which is children malnutrition and their health. So Danone came up with a very small size yogurt with all essential ingredients for small children. They put the manufacturing plant in Bangladesh, and the women were employed to go door to door and sell those little cups for the children. Today, it's not only a profitable venture, it has open branches in many other countries. These are some practical examples of successes to look at and give resources and capacity to BDIC to explore and deliver in similar successful ways which have been proven. To conclude, and going back to my original and vital question, why does BDIC exist? Does it exist as an economic developer or a lender of last resort or as another financial institution? If it is a financial institution, then it has to function in a different operating environment. If it is a lender of last resort, then the outcome is to be measured in quantity of files in the credit portfolio and not the quality of files in the portfolio. However, when the role is of an economic developer, then without doubts, it involves social aspects. We need to keep pace with change and map the road to economic prosperity of NWT accordingly. The limited available resources are to be invested strategically. There were times when microfinancing was the buzzword. Crowdfinancing gained momentum after that. And with change in time, now social financing is playing a vital role not only in provinces and territories across Canada, but also in economies of countries worldwide. The question is, why does BDIC exist? And can we together with the BDIC board and staff map the vision and road to achieve it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chugh. Appreciate your presentation. Now, was there specific, as you'd mentioned earlier, were there specific slides that you wanted to actually go back to provide us additional detail, or it was just how you referenced them as you were going forward was what you wanted to do?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The intent was, given the time, to summarize all the slides in the presentation. But if there is time, I can go slide by slide. If there is any specific question, I can go to that particular slide.
No, that's fine. I appreciate that. I just thought that I understood earlier that you might want to go back to some specific ones. That said, I will turn it over to committee for comments, questions, concerns from committee. As you are aware, we've been discussing BDIC matters over the last few years, and we've been trying more than once to try to get you in here to present to us today. And so, committee, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns that you'd like to share, now's the time. Who do I have first? Danny, or sorry, Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the legislation we passed last week on BDIC allowances for the new legislation and utilizing your interest to reinvest back in operations, sort of thing. But I'll just refer back to page number 5. Okay, you're on page number 5. My question on page number 5, on the last bullet paragraph, BDIC inherited a loan portfolio from the Business Credit Corporation that totaled $41.5 million. Can you explain the transaction or the transfer of this portfolio? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Chugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. BDIC formation was merger of two organizations, the BCC and the Business Development Corporation. At that time, the loan portfolio we inherited from BCC was $41.5 million. That was the portfolio which was moved to BDIC when the two organizations were merged. So that's what it refers to. Today, that number we still have the portfolio of $41.5 million. We owed more than $41.5 million when we inherited that money because that was a loan from GNWT to BDIC. So we had to pay that money back to GNWT. Today, that amount is $20 million, even though the portfolio is same. And that's where I was mentioning too, the slide that we have made big leaps in success. in running the loan fund. Thank you.
Thank you. Further, Mr. McNeely?
Okay, I was just curious to understand. I'm really not that up to date on the new current status of BDIC. I've heard about it for many years. And so I'm just curious on the current status here. And one of my next question is, there's other lending programs out there, such as Community Futures or MDDF. Is there a arrangement or an MOU amongst three of you organizations on lending arrangements or working together to accommodate the application between you three groups, an MOU type arrangement? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chugh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, unfortunately not. There is no MOU between the three organizations on lending agreement. That was what I was referring to, one-stop shop, that when BDIC was formed, that was the intent, that there be an MOU, and up to a limited amount, the Community Futures will deliver. The one-stop concept which was put to us at that time was a client walks into the door, there is a receptionist, looks at the request. If it is less than the amount which Community Futures are allowed, they have a limit of some. At that time, it used to be $125,000, $150,000. Now, in some places, it has raised to $200,000 for Community Futures. So if the client's application is less than that, the client will be directed to Community Future. If it was higher, it will be directed to BDIC. The arrangement would be that applications will be evaluated at one place, and depending on the amount being asked for, the application will be transferred to the appropriate organization. It never materialized, unfortunately.
Thank you. Further to that, Mr. Jensen?
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Certainly.
To the point that MLA McNeely raises, last December, ITI and Canor co-chaired a process, we call it Access to Capital. And what we've put in motion is a process to bring all of the organizations, government organizations, and excuse me, and development corps that currently provide some range of service, whether or not it's aftercare, whether or not it's lending, whether or not it's contributions, both in terms of government grants and lending capital. We've brought those folks together, and we had a session called Access to Capital back in December. And the purpose of that meeting was to start to map out who's doing what in this space, because there, I think, as MLA is alluding to, there are a number of actors in the space. There are Community Futures, there's BDIC, there's seed grants, there's Canor grants, there's a whole bunch of the Métis Development Corp. There are a whole bunch of players in this space that are trying to work towards the same higher purpose. And so we've started this process and have had that initial meeting where we just started to map out who's doing what, are there possible duplications, are there possible synergies that can be developed, is there a possibility for developing agreements across those organizations. So our intention is to in the fall hold another session where we can dig deeper into these very questions to see if there are some efficiencies, some economies of scale that can be achieved through that process. And of course, we see BDIC as very much a significant player in that. Keep in mind that ITI is as well, given the fact that we do a lot of the work around preparing applications in the regions, as well as we have a seed program where we provide grants and so on. So I thought it might be helpful for the committee, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. McNeely?
I'll have one last question. At this time, I might have more later on, but I just want to make some room for my other colleagues here. At the community level, I really see a need for awareness, education, community campaigning. I get continuous questions. Who's who? What do they do? So I think, when I read this material off the get-go here, there's lots of concentration in this part of the territory, but not so much in the northern part. Your portfolios, your lending percentages dictate that. And it might be advisable to, as a lending program or a lender, follow the market and follow the projects. I'll give you an example. Okay, if the oil companies are coming back to the Sahtu or the Bear River Bridge is going to go ahead, that small mom-and-pop operation may want to access the opportunity, but are looking for a lender. So if your group could accommodate that by having a booth there in the community at the same token, as a presenter making a presentation on this economic infrastructure, bringing the influx of capital and opportunities to build that structure there. So I just throw that out there. And then at the same time, holding regional sessions, take the Community Futures program in Norman Wells. I think there might be some avenue for the chair of that board to be a co-board member to your organization here, bringing awareness from that organization that they represent to this territorial one. I just suggest that. Thank you.
Take that as a comment. Any comment to that? Mr. Chug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do appreciate and agree with the committee member that there is need for BDIC to be more aggressive in the committees. We did make some presentations in the past with help of our board member who represented the Norman Wells area. But definitely I agree there is a gap now because the member, there is no member from Norman Wells at the current time on the board, and I think there are attempts being made by the department to fill that vacancy. But that gap has definitely created some gap for the smaller businesses. Also, anything less than $200,000, really speaking, they try to send the applicant first to Community Futures, or at the regional level, they evaluate the application. We don't get to see it. Thank you.
Next I have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the things that, the only real question for me is this issue of BDIC's identity crisis, and I'm, of course, not speaking to the people who are working behind the scenes. I appreciate the work you do, and I think it's important work as well. But as we heard in the presentation, what should BDIC become? A financial institution, a lender of last resort, an economic development agency, and how do we support BDIC to be successful at those functions? And, over the past 2 years, we've been looking at significant cuts to BDIC, and we passed legislation recently to allow them access to offset some of those cuts. But that doesn't mean they have more money to use, Mr. Chair. It just means that now they have a way to offset some of the cuts that have already been coming. So my question is, what should BDIC become? Because that's a question we've been asking the minister responsible for a long time. What is his vision for BDIC? Is he trying to shutter BDIC through these cuts? What do we want to do here? So I'd like to ask our witnesses what they think BDIC should become, what it's best positioned to do, and how this committee can support them getting there. Thank you.
One thing, too, and I'll just remind you that the presentation is technical in nature, and so political responses might not be suitable for the witnesses here today, but I'll put the question to you. So, to Mr. Chuk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've given the examples of success, and they kind of show where the world is going at present times. Doesn't mean that it's we are always changing. The world is changing. And as I mentioned in my example, there have been changes going forward. But more so now, a new role has come to organizations like ours, which is the social financing side of things and developmental lender side of things combined together. So that's where the successful projects are leading to, which are addressing more than one issue, not just economic development, but also aim at some social issues, whether it's child health care or whether it's homelessness, whether it's shortage of housing. There are different ways to address those issues and still be economic developmental lenders. And I think, as the Deputy Minister has mentioned, efforts to get all the parties together and lead the way to some kind of that developmental projects would probably be beneficial, in my opinion. Thank you.
Further, Mr. Testart?
If I could hear from the Deputy Minister, Mr. Jensen, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the acknowledging that I won't be making any sort of a political comment on this. But we are engaging, we're on the cusp of starting to do the program reviews. As members are aware, there's a requirement statutorily to do a 5-year review of BDIC. We have worked up the terms of reference with BDIC, and we're just finalizing them. And as the chair, I'm sure, is aware, and members are aware, we have a commitment to share those terms of reference, have discussion with this committee, and you'll be able to see what the terms of reference for the review will be. I think there's a real opportunity in that review to take a look at helping to answer that question through the kinds of questions that the terms of reference will be addressing, and we'll be getting a consultant to work on. So I think that's the main point I'd make. The other point I would make is that the mandate is currently in the Act for BDIC, and it's clearly laid out in the Act as part of the mandate. So, but again, through the review, there may be some adjustments to try to answer that question.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Testart? Nothing further? Questions? Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm glad that the Deputy Minister raised the issue of the 5-year review. I'm just wondering what this timing and scheduling of that is going to be, and what the department would like to see. Well, it might not be appropriate to ask the department, but yeah, well, let's start with that. Thanks.
Sorry, your question is to?
To the Deputy Minister to find out about the timing of the program review for BDIC. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Jensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The current target is to complete the review by December of 2018, but we will engage the committee through that process as we go through the process.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks. If I could ask Mr. Chug then about the review. I think BDIC has been through these kind of reviews before, and I'm just wondering what it is that BDIC, what kind of level of involvement and engagement do they see or do they hope for in this review, and what kind of things would they like to see come out of it? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Chug?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. BDIC involvement in these reviews has been very limited in past because we can't review our own selves. So somebody else has to review BDIC rather than BDIC reviewing it itself. As an outcome, definitely we'd like to see which direction BDIC should be moving forward in, given that it is 15 years, almost 15 years that I've been CEO of BDIC since its inception, and lots has changed in the last 15 years. So the review involves looking at the mandate and looking at the resources and how that mandate can be fulfilled. BDIC is looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks. I I guess I'd like to go back then to the Deputy Minister. Who's going to carry out this review? Is it going to be an independent third party, or is it going to be the department, or are both of those options, or how is this going to take place? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The review will be conducted by a third party. We have not finalized who that will be at this point. The ITI's involvement in this is as part of a steering committee, which will include, and it's in the terms of reference, it will include representatives from BDIC, from ITI, from the Department of Finance. And I think it's also important to point out that the terms of reference in draft have currently been shared with the BDIC board as well. So we are undertaking a very collaborative process with BDIC to do this review. Perhaps it's different than, I wasn't around for the past reviews, but I think perhaps the approach we're taking sounds to me like it might be a little bit more collaborative, where we're engaging BDIC. They'll be on the steering committee. The board has reviewed the terms of reference, and we will continue to engage the board as we will this committee and our minister as we go through the steps of the review by the independent third party. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, that's helpful. I don't know, I guess it's very early, but is there going to be an attempt to engage the public in any way? Some of the clients that BDIC has worked with and assisted over the years, or is that all still up for discussion? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jensen?
The short answer to the member's question is yes. There will be engagement with stakeholders. There are a number of partners, as Mr. Chuk has outlined in delivery services. There are a number of partners that are involved in this. There will be discussions and reviews with them as well. And there will be, and I think Mr. Chuk pointed this out earlier in terms of the lack of client involvement, there will be some work to review how clients are viewing current services of BDIC and what their experience has been. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Nothing further. Next I have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the presentation, there was a statement that there's a social aspect to lending decisions. Can our witnesses provide specifics as to how social development considerations are factored into lending decisions, especially in comparison to traditional lenders such as banks? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chuk.
Thank you. At present, it's limited. The portfolios are themselves divided. For example, we have a subsidiary program which has a social aspect to it, and we invest almost $1 million every year in that program, where we are promoting arts and crafts, we are promoting employment, and community development from under that portfolio. In terms of lending, we do look at another portfolio we have, which is Business Development and Project Fund, where we give money to youth or upcoming businesses. And that's where quite a bit of money goes into these new projects, which are socially mandated. In last few years, we have given quite a bit of money from BDPF to smaller and upcoming businesses which are addressing some social problem in one way or the other. And something which comes to my mind right away is Fort McPherson. We opened so many files in Fort McPherson based on the social request which had a social angle to it. Thank you.
Further, Mr. Testart?
Yeah, and so further to my question, how is the value of social factors such as training, unemployment, et cetera, factored into the calculation? Like, is there a matrix or point system awarded to those kind of the social side of socioeconomic calculations? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chuk?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the member has pointed at one of the weak nerve we have. In the past, we were not tracking the results of this. But recently, from a year or two, we couldn't go back behind too much because of lack of data. We have started capturing data on social side of things now from last year and two. What we are now gathering, and that's where some of these numbers speaks to the number of people who have been employed, how many people have been successful, how many people they employed further as success to the project which we funded for, how it has contributed to the economy. So we are making a basket of performance evaluation, which we are calling as our performance measurement, based on both social and economic aspects. But yes, I agree with the member that we were not capturing that before, but we have started capturing those data now. Thank you.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Testart?
No, nothing further. Thank you.
Nothing further. Next, I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Adding to the question of what should BDIC become. For me, I see a need for BDIC as a lending institution, providing not only term loans, but education through working with the various clients out there. After all, our jurisdiction is 33 communities. And 33 communities are very much different in a lot of ways. Some of them don't even have an economy. You take government out of the community, you might as well fold up your teepee and move to the next. And in the absence of, to a large degree, industry, well, there's nothing out there. So this is where I'm kind of satisfied in hearing the words that you're looking at the social aspect of the application, because there always will be a social factor to the application coming into your office. So I realize that, and I see a need for BDIC, and I'm glad, okay, well, you're gonna do a 5-year review, and that continuous, as one of my colleagues had mentioned, revisit the idea of review and efficiencies. So that in-house or that review, I compliment your program or department doing that. On the average, my question is, on the average, on the application itself, what is the time frame on turnarounds? I walk into your office today, submit an application. When can I expect a decision? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have timelines set for applications that we have to respond within those number of days. A lot depends on the amount of the application, and so the number of days to complete the evaluation of that application depends on the amount the application is asking for. That's one factor. The second factor which we consider is the number of days from the date we have received completed application. If, for example, the requirement is to have audited financial statements or at least reviewed financial statements attached to the application because of the amount being involved, and there are no financial statements, we don't consider it to be a complete application submitted to us. So those dates don't get counted. We start counting the dates from the day we get completed applications. On slide 5, we do have decision timelines, table 4, which speaks to that application process standard working days and targeted working days, up to $200,000. The regional superintendent has the authority. Our target is 10 days. We have 15 days if it comes to the headquarters. The CEO has to approve it. 20 days if it's a ARC committee decision. ARC committee decision is when the application is over $500,000. So each amount has a different, we do have mandated standard number of days. For BDPF applications, for example, the target and standard is 10 days. If you look at the chart, you'll find that our attempts have been successful to keep the average working days under these targets. Thank you.
Thank you. Further, Mr. McNeely?
Okay, thank you for that schedule. I'll read material here. As I mentioned earlier, your institution is needed, or your programs. Really, like, I know a lot of people in my area don't qualify for commercial loans from a commercial bank just because of various reasons. So this is where you come in. And as I mentioned in my first presentation, I would encourage you to reach out to these smaller communities. There might not be anything going on there at this point in time, but a periodic visit to Delaney, for example, or even Siggetchik for that matter, or Nahanni Butte. At least, I think that leadership will respect you in coming in, and we're still here kind of approach. And my question on that is, on part of your 5-year review, are you gonna have a campaign plan as part of your review? Or I suspect there'll be a report from the review. Is there gonna be a campaign advertising component to that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That's more of the program review. Maybe I'll put that to Mr. Jensen.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. If I understand the member's question, I would say that has not been considered at this point, member.
Thank you. Further, Mr. McNeely?
Yeah, I just asked, is there gonna be one, yes or no?
I believe there will be there certainly will be the report. But further to that, Mr. Jensen?
I think yes, absolutely, there will be a report. And the question, I think, is whether or not we will actually take that report out once it's done and do some more community-based engagement on that, member? Is that the question?
Thank you. Mr. McNeely?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just clarify a little bit. What I mean by the campaign marketing plan is, rather than having pamphlets from BDIC hand-delivered to the EDO offices in Delaney, for example, a personal presentation from BDIC staff. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. To Mr. Chug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the member's suggestion and will definitely make sure that we make presentations on how BDIC can help the smaller communities. We have made in past, as I mentioned before, my board chair actually went with me to Toledo and those communities. We made presentation in Norman Wells. I think probably we will be looking forward to opportunities to talk to the members, the board, meeting with the members, getting suggestions, and letting them know when we are visiting a particular committee so that the member is aware that we'll be there making the presentation. And so there will be a plan which will be shared with the members. Thank you.
Thank you. Further to that, Mr. Jensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think given the relationship between BDIC and the regional offices in terms of the credit facilities and the preparation of application, I would see that as being an opportunity for both organizations to be making that kind of a presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further from committee? If there's nothing further, I'll just raise a couple of comments. One is I see BDIC's critical role, aside from the lending component, which I think is well established, and when you're taking steps toward improving application processes and the pace in which applications are reviewed, those are important because typically you're dealing with business or startups, and they move at a fairly rapid pace. And when they're looking for money to invest in innovation, technology, new business plan, they really can't wait for months on end. They have to have access to their capital as soon as possible in order to advance their ideas. So the lending aspect of BDIC is a critical one in my view. But more importantly, and this goes beyond Yellowknife probably into the smaller communities, is this idea, as Member McNeely alluded to, that beyond government in some of these communities, there is not much there to create employment. And so with the onset of the internet and access to information through the internet, and we've done a good job as a government now to get fiber optic line running up and down the entire valley. More broadband is being brought into more communities. It's becoming more reliable. It's being used in the schools for education. Young people are becoming invigorated and energized by the ideas of what entrepreneurialism can bring and what that might bring to their communities. And many of these communities, aside from government, in the future, starting now and going forward, are going to rely heavily on small business. And so I think we can't forget that there has to be a ever-present educational piece about entrepreneurialism and small business and what benefits they can have in these smaller, more remote communities. And as Mr. McNeely alluded to, one only has to go and travel into the communities for a day or two to get an idea of what that's all about. We recently, as a committee, came back from Norman Wells, and that's what they talk about, is what does the future look like to them? Because it doesn't look that good if you just want to talk about oil and gas. But it does look a lot better if you want to talk about tourism. And they have the people there that want to have that conversation. But those people, as much as they have the creative ideas about what they could or want to do around tourism, they don't have the resources as it relates to business development, writing business plans, putting in financial applications, that sort of thing. And so I would just encourage BDIC that when you do go and undertake your program review, that it goes maybe a little bit beyond just programming and really goes a little bit deeper into the organization itself and considers a little bit more of what the org of the company is going to look like as well. Because we just don't want to do program reviews and say, oh, things are good, let's speed up our application processes, that sort of thing, because we're hearing criticism about that sort of thing. This has to go a little bit deeper into the questions in which Mr. Testart was alluding to, was what is the future of BDIC really going to be about in terms of it as an organization, right? And so Futurepreneur is a organization that I've been a part of for since its inception here in the Northwest Territories. And it was really starting to grow some legs over a period of a couple of years. Now it seems to have subsided a little bit. Do I feel that that may be because of some of the cuts that have gone on recently and what have you? Arguably it could be. But I've seen that as a very successful program that put out a lot of good learning sessions. I was happy to be a mentor in that program. And those are the kinds of programs that we want to see go beyond just Yellowknife and start to reach out to some of the smaller communities. Really, I think that that's all I had for my comments. I don't know if there's any final comments that maybe what I'll do is put to each of you, and I'll start with Mr. Chuk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome your comments, and I want to assure you that we have not given up on our initiatives which were proved successful with Futurepreneur Canada. You'll probably be pleased to know that tomorrow I'm meeting with Joel on continuing discussion with how to proceed with or without Futurepreneur and continue on the programs we have already proved successful. As I mentioned in my presentation, the cuts do have impact, but we are not giving up. We'll continue with what we have already seen as successful. And to reiterate and basically assure the member from Norman Wells also that our next step on these programs is to go to communities, take them to communities where we can do mentor-mentee relationship, we can have boot camps, we can talk to the upcoming entrepreneurs and see what we can do for them. That's the next step we have already charted out. So I'm meeting with Joel tomorrow, and I have also other organizations now who have approached us, seeing the success of our partnership with Futurepreneur, and they are saying, can we partner with you and can we do this thing, we are good in this. And that's what I meant by collaborations, that there are organizations, rather than seeing us as competition to Community Futures or competition to Futurepreneur, if we see this is their strength, if we can collaborate with them and could do something from NWT, that's the approach we are taking. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it. Mr. Jensen.
Thanks for the opportunity for some concluding comments. To your point, Mr. Chair, I think it's a very important point that the program review, I think, necessarily needs to look at the organization as well and how it's doing its business. I think that clearly you'll see that in the terms of reference when we bring them forward, and we can have more discussion about that when we bring them to your committee. At the end of the day, what we need to do with BDIC is position the organization to be successful in the future. And if it requires some organizational changes, and to Mr. Chuk's point earlier about whether or not there are more or different amendments required to bring forward to the Assembly for changes to the Act, all of that should be on the table in order to get to a place where this organization is going to meet the needs of Northwest Territory population. So, and I think another really important part of this is the initiative we have around access to capital. I think we need to think about BDIC and what it's doing now, what it should do in the future, in the context of what other organizations are doing and should do in the future. So I'm optimistic that we can get those folks like BDC, the Community Futures Corporations, Major Development Corporation, the seed grants, the CANOR grants, hoping that we can align those programs much better, more effectively, more efficiently in order to serve the client, which is obviously why we're all here. So thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chair, and those are my concluding comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate BDIC coming here today and ITI contributing to the conversation. I think in general that is what we want to see, is a better BDIC at the end of the day that's not going to be lost in its identity, one that's going to know exactly what Northerners and NWT residents want for small business and economic development. And I know that this committee wants to see BDIC be integral to that, and that's very important. We'll look forward to seeing what the department presents in the fall as it relates to the upcoming business plan, and we'll certainly look forward to taking part in any part of the review as you move forward. So just thank you all once again for coming today and presenting, and committee may have a letter or what have you that comes to you in the near future as it relates to sharing some maybe comments or what have you that we might want to share with you. So thank you, and with that we can be finished with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.